Okay, so on to the second part of the George Washington notes. Remember that you should have finished up that first page, and in order to get the second page, you needed to show that completed to the sub. You're going to fold that first page in on 111 in your ISN. You're going to get this second page, and it will eventually go in on 112 once you go through it. It's just all the way straight through, filling in the blanks like we just did with the other one. So let's go ahead and pick up where we left off. Remember, when we left off, we were talking about the fact that George Washington did not have a political party. Because when he was nominated and voted in as president, political parties had not been formed. But while he is president, political parties do start to form. And during his second term, these parties really took shape and really kind of started to delineate themselves, and even came up with names, even became named. The Federalists was one of the political parties, directly evolving from that Federalist group that we talked about when we talked about ratification of the Constitution. And then the other side, very long name, the Democratic Republicans. And they kind of started forming based on the responses to events that were occurring around the world, but especially in the United States and connected to the United States, and how not only George Washington was handling those events, but how people in his cabinet viewed how to handle those events. Because even within his cabinet members, there were differing opinions. So let's talk about kind of some of the background of current events in the world in 1793, so during Washington's second term, right at the beginning. So the citizens in France had watched the American colonies fight this Revolutionary War and get their independence from Great Britain, and were inspired by that. And so they decided to rebel against their own monarchy in France. And so the French Revolution takes place, and they were battling over some different topics than we were, because they were all living in France. It wasn't colonies, but it was citizenry who felt like they were not being treated fairly or given individual rights. But this revolution really went above and beyond even the Revolutionary War, which obviously was violent, it was war, but the French Revolution, extremely bloody, extremely violent, like record-breakingly so. Many people even around the world found it to be offensive. Some Americans supported the idea of the French citizens having, their independence and their individual rights, but some people couldn't even get behind their cause because it was so brutal and so violent over there. And of course, Britain and France also were at war with each other at the same time. It seems like that's just a constant recurring theme in world history. Britain and France have always disliked each other, always at war. And Americans who were living in the southern part of the country, who were farmers, and kind of independent as far as living off the land, living for themselves, they were in support of France in this war. And Americans in the North, who were much more invested in industry and cloth making and factory pieces as it starts to process, things like that, actually were in support of England. So you see that first event, or that first circumstance that starts dividing our country, North versus South, as far as their belief system, their philosophy, and who they would even support in this war. And George Washington could kind of feel that divide happening too in the country, and he knew that that was not a good thing to happen, for a country to be divided. So he determines that he's going to make a really strong statement about where the United States, where their loyalties were lying in this specific war. And he actually decided that America would completely stay out of it. That our policy from here on out needed to be, if it is not a war that literally involves our country, then we need to leave it alone. We need to allow these other countries to fight out their wars themselves. We're going to stay neutral on foreign affairs. We're not going to pick sides. And so he puts that together as an official proclamation called the Neutrality Proclamation. He wanted to avoid another war with Britain and or France. He wanted to avoid becoming entangled in that. He wanted to stay neutral in foreign affairs. So he issues the Neutrality Proclamation and basically tells all Americans, we're all going to stay out of it. And this is going to anger those who were pro-French. They were still kind of anti-federalists at that point. The Democratic Republicans will really start to form after this takes place. But the Neutrality Proclamation is a huge, important piece of basically American governmental philosophy that George Washington puts into place. And it actually really remains intact for a very, very long time. We'll see in the upcoming weeks when that kind of, when we veer away from it and what happens. But basically his Neutrality Proclamation set up two big, huge, major initiatives. First of all, it prohibited any American from fighting in the war between France and England. So you couldn't even as an individual citizen decide, maybe America's not going to fight, but I'm going to go support my friends in England or, the people in France who I believe in their cause. They were prohibited from doing that. Washington didn't want anybody entangled in it. But it also prohibited British warships from using American ports, American seaports. They could not bring their ships in to American ports because as this war had gotten started, the British started capturing American ships. And essentially they would what we call impress the American crews or kidnap them and force them to serve in the British Navy. They would forcefully make them serve in the British Navy. And sorry, you can't see that, but serve in the British Navy. And basically kidnap them. It's called impressment. So obviously George wanted to make sure that practice stopped and that our American citizens, our naval crews and our merchant crews were no longer being kidnapped and utilized in the war. So those are some of the major precedents and the major policies that the Neutrality Proclamation put into place. And it was really a pretty bold statement on his part. He basically told the country, but he also told the world, we're not getting involved. This is between you two. You guys work it out. We're keeping to ourselves. So leave us out of it. So this neutrality, like I kind of mentioned, stands as one of Washington's greatest accomplishments. Because we stayed out of it, because we allowed ourselves not to get entangled in a big, huge global war when we were, of course, already in debt from the Revolutionary War, it allowed the United States time to build a solid system of government, just that good initial foundation. It allowed us time to expand westward, which, of course, we're going to be talking about soon as well as the country grows. It also helped us to develop what's called a merchant marine, to engage in trade without becoming embroiled in another European war. So merchant marines basically are a naval service, but their sole job is trade, right? We're going around to different European countries, different Asian countries, and we're trading, all right? We did not want to get involved in the war part of things. We still wanted to be able to trade. So when you talk about a merchant marine, you're sending people over there who are not part of a military contingent. They are solely there for trade, but they are under the protection of the U.S. government. And so it's known that if you do anything to them, if you harm them, if you kidnap them, if you capture them, if you stop them from doing their job in any way, you are, basically affronting the United States government. So this was really a critical component of Washington's presidency, and it was a super smart move. He knew that we didn't have the strength as a brand new country to engage in another war, that we really needed to focus on ourselves and really build our own country up before we ever got entangled again in a war situation. So we move on to another event that's going to happen. We need a little bit of background on that event. So we'll go back to 1791. Congress had created a tax on the production of whiskey and other luxury goods to raise money for the new government. So remember, we talked about this, the fact that our new country was in debt. We needed money to be able to pay for a lot of different things. And so one of the ways they did was to decide to tax luxury items. Notice that it's luxury items, not everyday items that people really needed to live. They understood that those were not the kinds of things that you should put a tax on. If it's a luxury item, it's not something that you necessarily need. You might want it. And, you know, if you have the money to be buying luxury items, their thought was, well, then you can pay a little bit extra and utilize that tax money to support our new country and our new government. Well, Western farmers become very upset about this tax because hauling their grain, which is the main component of whiskey, across the Appalachian Mountains to sell in the East was really expensive. So one of the things that they started doing was turning that wheat into whiskey because it was cheap for them to do it. And of course, it cost a lot less to trek the whiskey barrels across the mountains than all these sheaths and sheaths of grain and wheat. So the farmers refuse to pay the tax. This goes on for a while, and in 1793, Congress decides, okay, our goal isn't to hurt farmers. Our goal is to just, try to build up the coffers and pay off the debt. So they do go ahead and lower the tax, and that satisfies most of the farmers who are then paying the lower tax, all except a small group of a few Pennsylvania farmers. So when the tax collectors go to this specific group in Pennsylvania, they are tarred and feathered. Clearly, this was before the Eighth Amendment outlawed that punishment, and we've talked about how cruel this was. So you know it's a very big deal for them to do that. So Alexander Hamilton and George Washington see the actions of the farmers as a threat to the authority of the government, because remember, it's the government who's sending the tax collectors to get the money. Washington does not want this to get out of hand. Remember that he had been part of the situation with Shays' Rebellion those years back, and he did not want it to get out of hand. So he ends up sending the state militia of Pennsylvania to crush the rebels, and the rebels do back down. And so he is able to end it quickly. But Thomas Jefferson kind of thought that was a little bit of overkill. He thought sending all those troops to take care of just a few rebels was a little silly. He even thought that Hamilton seemed as though, because this was partly his idea, that it seemed as though he was stepping on the rights of the people to oppose their government. Remember, we talked about the fact that under the First Amendment, you have the right to protest, the right to assemble peaceably, the right to have your opinion heard. And of course, we were taking that very seriously at the time because we were still brand new and these rights were still new. Jefferson wasn't really sure that this action supported those individual freedoms in the First Amendment. So a little bit of kind of controversy there. So this event becomes known as the Whiskey Rebellion, a rebellion that broke out in 1794 in Pennsylvania. Washington would send in troops to end that rebellion. Remember, you can always pause this because I'm going to move quickly. You can pause it to fill in your blanks and then move on. Basically, the significance of the Whiskey Rebellion was the fact that, okay, sure, you can protest the government. We've got that First Amendment right, but you must follow the laws while you are rebelling. We also talked about that when we talked about the First Amendment. There's a difference between protesting and assembling. There is also a big difference between that and rioting or looting or burning or doing harm, right? Civil disobedience is okay. Physical harm to person or property is not. And of course, physically tarring and feathering those tax collectors was doing harm, and it wasn't following the laws. So it got out of hand. It went beyond the protection of the First Amendment rights to protest. But the good news was this proved that when there was a concern and when there was kind of this outbreak of rebellion,